Hey there, I'm FakeFox, and this is my complete PvE healing class guide for Warden. Hope you enjoy. Warden is easily the most dominant PvE healer class at the moment. Warden offers more support than any other class, but its healing, survival, sustain and mobility are also top tier. Even the damage potential for off healing builds is extremely good. Warden really doesn't have a weakness when it comes to PvE healing right now. It should come as no surprise that Warden can be played in all PvE activities. But if you're interested in a more detailed analysis of Warden's performance and specific content, I will do that at the end of the video. In the first part, I will now go over all of Warden's abilities and passives. Warden's healing line is Green Balance. When healing someone with a Green Balance ability, we get 250 of our lowest resource. And if the target happens to be under 40% health, also Major Mending. Every solid Green Balance skill increases healing done by another 2%. And lastly, healing someone gives them minor toughness for 20 seconds, which is Warden's class exclusive buff. The first active skill is Fungal Growth, a very strong conal burst heal. It has a very long range, and the Magicamorph Enchanted Growth gives the minor recovery buffs, making it quite useful across the board. Healing Seed is basically a ground heal over time. With the Budding Seed's morph, it is actually kind of a hybrid between hot and burst heal, but it usually is just played like any normal hot. High range and strong healing make it very good, only the 6-second duration can be quite annoying. Corrupting Pollen can also be played for the minor cowardice if the lost healing can be compensated. The idea behind Living Vines is to apply it on the tank so they get healed when they take damage. The problem is that the skill is too weak, unreliable and specific, and both morph effects are also just kind of pointless, so I would never use it in PvE. Lotus Flower, specifically Green Lotus, is quite a nice passive healing output for dungeons. It's very cost and time efficient, and the critical chance buff is also nice for playing without spell power potions. But I would not use it for trials because the healing and target cap are just too low to make a difference. Nature's Grasp is a very unique movement ability because it pulls you to an ally. So it can be good for movement in certain situations, but the Bursting Vines morph is also a really good burst heal. The heal is strong, it generates ultimate, and is one of only 2 healing abilities in the entire game with a fully controllable targeting. And the most prominent use case for that is healing Ice Tomes in the Locustids fight in Sunspire. And the ultimate of Green Balance is Secluded Grove. It has the same issue that any healing ultimate has in PvE, it's just a pointless waste of support potential. Next up is Warden's damage line, Animal Companion. The first passive heals us every time an Animal Companion skill runs out, and is pretty insignificant. The remaining 3 are really good though. We generate 4 ultimate every 8 seconds when using an Animal Companion skill, and we deal 2% more damage for every skill of that line we have slotted, and also get 12% more regeneration for having one slotted in general. So we always want to have at least one Animal Companion skill on our front bar, and we also want to actively use one. The first active ability is Dive, Warden's box standard spammable. It is not particularly great, and integrating a spammable also has a low priority anyway when integrating damage into a Warden healing build. The Cutting Dive morph also has a dot component that can be used for Zen builds, but it is somewhat unreliable because of the proccing conditions. Scorch is a very strong damage ability that is great for integrating into healing builds. Subterranean Assault is usually the preferred morph to save on global cooldowns. Deep Fissure can also be played instead if Major Breach and Minor Breach are needed. Swarm is a good single target dot. It is important for Warden healers to be able to keep up minor vulnerability. Fetcher Infection is the preferred morph because it deals more damage and can be kept up on multiple targets. Badinage is Warden's long duration sustain skill. Both morphs are similarly useful depending on the needed resource. It also provides major sorcery and has a built-in cleanse, which is pretty neat. Falcon Swiftness is an instant cast speed buff and is really good for kiting rolls. Usually Deceptive Predator is used to be more survivable. And the Animal Companion ultimate is Feral Guardian. The bear deals a very high consistent damage and is really good for single target encounters when no support ultimate is needed. Otherwise, the skill can also be slotted without summoning the bear for the Animal Companion passives. The third skill line is Winter's Embrace, a mix between defense and damage. The passives increase the chance to apply Chilled, the Frost status effect, with Winter's Embrace skills by 200%. We also do 10% more critical damage and healing on chilled targets. The healing doesn't really do much, as PvE players are never chilled, pun fully intended, but the rest is actually pretty useful. Further, we get 500 resistances for every Winter's Embrace skill slotted. This never amounts to much, as we rarely ever have more than one per bar, but 0.8% damage reduction is still better than none. We also have 15% snare resistance, which is actually a lot better than you might think. And lastly, we deal 10% more frost and magic damage. Despite that, other elements are still better for damage, but Warden loses less damage for using Frost than other classes, making it interesting for brittle builds. The line's first active ability is Frost Cloak. It gives Major Resolve, the big resistance buff, to up to 12 players. While most classes have good access to this buff, having a central source is a lot more optimal, making the skill very strong. The preferred morph clearly is Expansive Frostcloak, as it makes it easier to apply and keeping a consistent uptime is important for damage mitigation effects. Impaling Shards, specifically the Winter's Revenge morph, is an extremely strong damage over time effect and deals frost damage, making it interesting for adding damage into builds as well as support triggered by frost damage such as Brittle or Elemental Catalyst. Arctic Wind is a heal, but because of its health scaling, it is mostly a tank skill and not really relevant for healers. The Shimmering Shield morph of Crystallized Shield can be used to gain major heroism in specific encounters where we constantly get hit by projectiles. It is a niche but extremely powerful ability. Frozen Gate gives Warden an alternative to Silver Leash. It's mechanically different and costs magicka, but the choice is mostly subjective. I would recommend having the Frozen Retreat morph, as it can be used to help stuck players. And the ultimate is Sleet Storm. As a damage ability, it is unfortunately pretty weak, but it can be used defensively. Barrier is a stronger defensive choice in most scenarios though. Permafrost is usually the preferable morph. In the next part of this guide, I will give you an overview to build creation for the Warden Healer. I will go over how to set up your bars, the different set combinations, champion points, and how to tie it all into an effective build. I'm going with teaching you how to create different builds over just showing you one specific build, as being able to create and adjust your own builds is really important for PvE healing. So first, I will talk you through my thought process when setting up my bars for a general PvE healing build. There are a few builds where this doesn't apply, but it works for easily 90% of PvE healing. I start out with my burst healing. My main burst heal is always either Combat Prayer or Enchanted Growth, or sometimes both if I need both buffs. If we have to deal with healing reduction mechanics, we might also have to use Steadfast Ward. Next, I sort out the healing over time, the source of the vast majority of my healing. This usually includes Illustrious Healing and Energy Orb. For trials, I usually play Budding Seeds as a third hot. In movement-heavy encounters, especially dungeons, I often replace Illustrious Healing with Radiating Regeneration or Echoing Vigor, but they can also function as a fourth hot. Ring of Preservation is also a good option in some situations. Then I almost always include Wall of Elements in my setups, usually the Unstable Wall morph for additional damage. This allows me to keep up my backbar enchantment, and I can also use it for additional support depending on my element and set choice. The rest of my setup is then entirely dependent on the group and activity. I check what buffs and debuffs I have to provide to then slot Fetter Infection, Frostcloak, Elemental Drain, Siphon Spirit, or Blood Altar. I also check if I need any special skills for a fight-specific mechanic, like a speed buff or taunt, or additional abilities for specific sets that I'm wearing, like Sensor Dress or Elemental Catalyst. If I don't have enough bar space for that, I might have to drop 1 or 2 healing skills. If I actually have more bar space than I need, I can use it for quality of life skills like Blue Betty or just damage. As ultimates, I mostly use Barrier and Aggressive Horn. In dungeons, I tend to go for damage ultimates instead if the tank has Aggressive Horn, as having 2 is often not worth it in those really short encounters. Then I arrange everything to make the best use out of my passives, and that's basically it. And as passives, in addition to the class skill lines, we need to have the weapon and armor passives of whatever we use, so usually Restoration Staff, Destruction Staff, Light and Medium Armor. Also important is Undaunted and maybe Mages and Fighters Guild if we use some of those abilities, and of course also the racial passives. From the Alliance War, we should get Magicka Aid for some extra regen whenever we use Barrier or Purge, and medicinal use from alchemy is also absolutely essential. And since I already mentioned race, Breton is in my opinion the best choice for pure healers, but if you want to go more into a hybrid direction or occasionally play as a damage dealer, I would recommend Altmer, Dumber or Khajiit instead. Let's continue with the set options. For dungeons and arenas, the idea is quite simple. We want to use the strongest support we can. For Warden, this is Spellpower Cure with either Master Architect or Elemental Catalyst. But other similar sets are also okay as well. For example, Olorim, Powerful Assault, Sexial Champion or Roaring Opportunist. For the remaining slots, I would generally recommend Spald of Ruin or Magma Incarnate, combined with a Maelstrom Destruction Staff or Pearls of Elnathay. We can play these setups as either an off-healer or full healer build. Though for an off-healer build, I would not recommend Spald of Ruin or Pearls of Elnathay. You could play with a damage mythic or monster set instead. For trial groups, it becomes a whole lot more complex. With 2 tanks, a second healer, and support damage dealers, we have a lot of different support sets in the group, and the main question becomes which position can make the best out of which set. In the next part, I will show you the by far most common set distribution at the moment. So for the first healer, we have the combination of Roaring Opportunist and Jovel's Guidance. This combination is pretty much set in stone, as Jovel's Guidance increases the duration of Roaring Opportunist. This combination works especially well with Spald of Ruin, because it has very high sustain, or otherwise any support monster set, most commonly Symphony of Blades. If your group wants to play with an off-healer, this setup should normally be used. It is then played with a Maelstrom Destruction Staff, otherwise a Master Restoration Staff is the weapon of choice. The second healer setup is a lot more flexible and often depends on the tanks. What we see a lot recently, and what is probably the most ideal build, because it has a lot of synergy, is Spellpower Cure or Olorim with Pearls of Elnathay, Nazare, and either Sexial Champion or Pillager's Prophet. The idea being to have a high healing power build that generates a lot of ultimate, which is then used for offensive support. However, while these builds generate a lot of healing power, they are actually difficult to play and lack flexibility because they need to constantly stay below 30% Magicka. And their effectiveness is dependent on good group coordination. So if that does not work out, it's usually a more generic combination of Spellpower Cure or Olorim with Stonetalker's Oath, Sexial Champion, Pillager's Prophet, or Powerful Assault. Elemental Catalyst, Sensor Dress, and Martial Knowledge are also an option, but because healers have so many other options at the moment, those should usually be played by damage dealers. They also tend to create difficult to play builds, which kind of defeats the whole point of not playing an Ultigen build in the first place. Warden can essentially play any position and set combination without issues. What you should ideally play depends more on who you're healing with. Warden can make a lot out of a Roaring Opportunist build, especially as an off-healer by, for example, providing Minor Brittle. It also has multiple buffs that scale with Joel's guidance, but I would argue that Necromancer benefits a bit more from being able to wear Jovolts. As far as ulti-gen builds go, Warden has no issues using them, but has, outside of very specific situations, not a lot of class-based ulti-gen, so Nightblade and Necromancer are the two strong ulti-gen classes and should take priority. Apart from that, Warden is the best class for Elemental Catalyst, together with Necromancer, because it can easily access an AoE dot for each element. It is also fantastic for Sensor Dress, because it has multiple single target dots, and the same goes for Martial Knowledge, because the stamina sustain is very controllable. The only somewhat problematic set is Encratis Behemoth, because you need an extra skill for it, but it is barely ever played by healers, and even then it's not really a big deal. Let's also quickly talk about armor types. You kind of have to deal with whatever the sets you want to use happen to be, but if possible you want to avoid wearing heavy armor as body pieces, and if you have a combination of medium and light, you have a decent amount of control. If you wear light armor as body pieces, you increase your magicka sustain. If you wear medium as body pieces, you increase your healing and damage instead. Next, we talk about traits and enchantments. On the armor, Divines with magicka is the best option. I do not recommend Infused Prismatic generally, but if you need to increase your health, you can use some. On the jewelry, both Arcane and Infused are good. Infused usually is ever so slightly stronger. And as enchantments, the goal is to go for 3 times spell damage, but sustain has gotten a lot tougher for healers lately, so we might need to use Magicka Regeneration. But don't just slot 3 times regen and call it good. Actually, test what you really need, otherwise you throw a lot of power out of the window. I would say a good start would be about 1500 Magicka Regeneration without a potion or group buffs. For our front bar weapon, we primarily want to use Powered for pure healing and Precise whenever we want to deal any relevant amount of damage, or Decisive for ulti-gen. Charged for status effects can also be good, either for a Sen or Brittle build. On the Destruction Staff or back bar, we usually want Infused. Using Charged to actively proc Minor Brittle is a trick that also works, but it's not something I can generally recommend, as it is quite micromanagement intensive. The weapon element doesn't really matter, unless we need a specific element for support. As enchantments, we can use Crusher or Weakening for support, or any element that we need for a status effect. And if we need nothing specific, we can just use Berserker. We always want the more important enchantment on the back bar, and never use the same enchantment twice. Moving on to buff food and attribute points. Basically, our default food is magicka and health. If we need more sustain, we can switch to magicka, magicka regeneration and health, or even magicka and magicka regeneration. To then adjust our health pool to a comfortable level again, we can use attribute points. We should have at least 22k health self-buffed, but going to around 25k is also fine. The rest of our attribute points should then be magicka. For the Mundus Stone, Ritual is the best for pure healing, and Thief for pure damage, as well as hybrid rolls. I wouldn't recommend Thief if all the damage you do is blockade and weaving, but if you even just go a little bit into damage, Thief is really worthwhile in my opinion, as the healing loss is basically non-existent. As potions, we usually want to use Essence of Spell Power in more difficult content, unless we get the buffs from another source. Then try Restoration Potions, for example, are also a really good choice. For easy content, I recommend just using up the potions you drop. Moving on to the champion points. The green CP mostly does matter, but what I do recommend is having Steed's Blessing to keep up with the group in between fights. For the blue CP, on full healing builds, I usually go with a split of 2 healing and 2 support nodes. For the healing power, I always go with Soothing Tide and Swift Renewal, as increasing a healing over time makes by far the largest impact. As support, we have Enlivening Overflow and Hope Infusion. If one of those is not needed, I usually either go for some other healing or damage node, depending on what my build is supposed to achieve. When a build has a relevant damage component, I tend to just go straight for damage nodes, usually Backstabber and a combination of Deadly Aim, Thaumaturge, Mastered Arms, Biting Aura and Fighting Finesse, depending on my damage sources. In the recipe, I absolutely always go for Celerity. In my opinion, movement speed is an amazing defensive tool, especially for healers, as we often have to run around a lot. Apart from that, Siphoning Spells is a great sustain tool I like to use for my off-healing builds in dungeons. Expert Evasion and Slippery can help with stamina sustain. Spirit Mastery can be useful as well, and Shield Master is nice when actively playing Barrier. And if nothing specific is needed, Boundless Vitality, Fortified and Rejuvenation are always good. In the next and final section of this video, we will now take a look at how Warden fits into group compositions and how you want to play the class in different activities. And we begin with dungeon groups. Warden and Necromancer are the two strong support classes in 4-player content. Both can be played as healer or tank, but I think Warden is more optimal as a healer in combination with a Necromancer tank. Warden especially shines if played as an off-healer, where Necromancer struggles to make full use of its support potential. Okay, let's now look at trials, where it gets a lot more interesting. Most group setups are built around the Warden Healer, because the class has multiple very important buffs, and those are usually best provided by a healer. However, as I already mentioned, the Warden's exact position in the group is somewhat dependent on the second healer, because Warden can play basically any position without issues, something that other classes can't do. Warden is the most mobile class, not only because it has good mobility skills, but because it doesn't need to stand still or inside the group for really anything. Warden even somewhat benefits from being further away. For that reason, the Warden should usually take the healer position with more movement. For example, kiting charge and poison on Oaxilzo, or picking up shards and kiting AoEs on Smaja. This allows the other healer to play more statically and focus on getting the maximum out of their build. This is especially the case when the second healer is playing a more complex build, like a Nightblade or Necromancer with an ulti-gen build, or an off-healer that can then maximize their DPS. And that's it for this video. If there are things you did not understand and you're looking for more beginner-friendly explanations, I recommend my beginner healing guide. It is linked in the description together with useful links for build creation. If you have any further questions, feel free to ask me in the comments, and thanks for watching. See you.